Consumers want to know the facts about the products they buy, but America's agricultural landscape is not easy to navigate. Between different companies, scientific advancement, government regulations, advertisement campaigns, and an unhealthy amount of myth and misconception, anyone would be hard-pressed to make sense of it. That's where Real Ag comes in. Kyle Bauer and the Real Ag crew bring you truthful, unbiased information about real agricultural concerns. From the producers who make your food, to the store where you buy the final product, and everything in between. This is Real Ag. Now, here's your host, Kyle Bauer.
This season, we've talked about all the factors that affect the food we eat: pests, disease, weather. Today, we're bringing it all together for you. This is the Real Ag Guide.
Production of Real Ag is made possible by
Servitech has been helping producers across the Midwest make the planet more productive since 1975. We are proud sponsors of Real Ag, helping tell the story of how your food makes it to your plate.
The Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.
Livestock producers fall under a set of rules where they must treat, they must apply that manure at agronomic rates and not over-apply the manure that would cause a runoff or cause environmental harm. So in fact, in Kansas, the Kansas Department of Health and Environment would be involved in the regulation of livestock producers. Livestock producers of certain sizes have official permits, not only in the state, but a federal permit that comes as well. And they must maintain all records for all manure management practices and disposal, and be also part of inspections where the Kansas Department of Health and Environment actually comes to the farm. They come to the farm every 1 to 2 years and inspect the practices going on. So in fact, that becomes the regulation portion of livestock operations as it relates to nutrition of what actually wasn't utilized in the diet and excreted by the animals.
I think the biggest thing that most people don't understand is the amount of regulation and research and safety for our food chain here in the United States.
Okay, so if we look at the difference between vaccines and animals and people, the first thing is, and probably the only difference, is how they're regulated. I mean, human vaccines are regulated by the FDA, Federal Drug Administration. Animal vaccines are licensed and regulated by the USDA. When we look at interactions we look at vaccine regulations, every vaccine has to be approved and licensed. And in doing so, they have to prove they're safe for both the animal and the public, and efficacious in that they do what they say they're going to do. They protect against what they're vaccinating them for. And doing that, the USDA oversees that. There are strict regulations in both vaccine production. So when we produce a vaccine, we actually have to check every lot that comes out. Every lot has a fail-safe that has to be within our limits. If it doesn't, it's never shipped. And that happens with all vaccine production companies. And so when we produce a vaccine, it's of the highest standards going out. No different than what our human side of the business would have to do to treat our animals with. So when we vaccinate a calf, you can assure it there's a USDA licensed registered number of that vaccine. It's been through the approval process. The USDA has done the trials on it to make sure it's efficacious and safe, that it works and won't do any harm, and that the production standards are constantly evaluated to make sure that vaccine is the same thing we say it is every time.
It's very meticulous. Veterinarians help with this. Regulation and educating producers on making sure that we have safety that goes onto the plate of our consumers. And so with these, all these regulations, and they test the meat too. Periodically, there's USDA inspectors at these processing plants that are again checking stuff to make sure it is very safe for human consumption. It is a big thing, and it's something that isn't taken lightly by veterinarians, by the producer, and then on down through to those that actually process the meat or eggs or milk.
When we look at the best, we have multiple ways to administer vaccines in animals. And there's different types of vaccines, and they all have fail-safes to protect any type of contamination in the food supply. We're not as worried about vaccines, but we do have the fail-safes in place. A withdrawal time is on products that may have an adjuvant, which is a carrier that could have a depot effect to provide a longer reaction. And those withdrawal times are max 60 days prior to slaughter.
So withdrawal time is just like with anything. Sometimes we hear about withdrawal times with antibiotics or anything that we're injecting into a food-producing animal. And once you inject something or give something to an animal, there is a regulation based on USDA, so the government in the Food and Drug Administration, when we could put that animal into the food chain based on whatever we're injecting. So you inject something, whether it's an antibiotic or a vaccine, you have to wait a certain time frame before they could slaughter that animal to use the meat.
There is a lot of training involved with aerial applicators before they ever become a spray pilot. We're talking hundreds of hours that are involved for training and certification. And getting comfortable with the equipment and getting comfortable with the products that are being applied. To do an aerial application, a pilot has to have a commercial pilot's license issued by the Federal Aviation Administration. That license requires extensive training over and beyond what a normal private pilot would have to have. Also, for aerial application, we have to be licensed with the state of Kansas, and requires a 1A applicators, is just the terminology they put on that. But the Kansas Department of Agriculture requires a 1A applicators license to do aerial application work in the state of Kansas. Every label for every product does show or does explain the required amount of time between application and when personnel can, whether it be a person or whether it be a producer, or workers can re-enter a field. The re-entry times on products that are used now have been greatly reduced from where they were 15, 20 years ago, just because of the safety and the registration of newer, higher tech products.
Well, the consumer is affected by the animal's diet from the perspective of growing these animals in the most economical means possible and keeping that in tandem with the animal's health and well-being. It's important that if we're able to achieve more efficient gains, then ultimately in the marketplace that means the most efficiently produced product.
When we have a healthier animal based on protection of diseases, we are in turn making for a better welfare for our animals out there. They're going to live a happier life, a healthier life, and in addition, all that goes into the producer. If they're producing an animal, if the animal is healthy and happy, they're going to be a better producer for whoever owns them. For the aspect of making more money, they're going to make and produce more product at a lower cost. In addition, that will again make for safety where we don't have to use as many antibiotics for those animals if their own immune system is fighting off disease and we're not needing to put a lot of extra products in those animals. So vaccines are doing wonderful things for the welfare of the animal and for the production of the animal, right down to the plate.
If we look at how vaccines affect the cost of food to the consumer, and really this comes down to two things. If we vaccinate, it really comes down to the cost of disease. You know, a lot of times we think the cost of disease are, for you or I, we go to the doctor, you know, we pay our exam fee, and then we pay for antibiotics, you know, and so we have, in cattle production, we have a labor cost to take them there to examine the animals and to treat them, and then we have a cost of antibiotics to the animal. Antibiotics run on upwards of 15 to 20 bucks a head to treat an animal for respiratory disease one time. And so that's a cost. Another cost we don't think about is that when an animal's sick with pneumonia, as it's recovering, it's not gaining weight, it's not growing, it's not producing the beef that we're trying to produce in those animals. Therefore, a goal that our industry has is we'd much rather prevent disease. I mean, our whole focus is prevention of disease, so we don't have to use antibiotics.
Well, individual consumers are many times buffered by kind of the global food supplies that we have now. So we could experience a disease outbreak here in Kansas, but if Oklahoma or North Dakota still was producing enough wheat, then the average consumer may not experience much of a loss. Or on an international scale, if Europe or South America is still producing enough wheat, then they may never experience the direct impact in their losses or increases in their own food supply or prices of bread, for example. So they're somewhat buffered by the international agriculture. But it does influence them on an individual basis. Certainly food spoilage is something that many of us have experienced. How many of us have brought home a nice container of beautiful red strawberries only to find one is shortly afterwards discovered to have kind of a gray fuzzy mold growth on it, and then shortly after that the whole package of strawberries is lost. So there's individual experiences that maybe people just don't realize would be covered by plant pathologists, in addition to some of the global food supply type of scales that are oftentimes buffered by the scale at which they occur.
As extension entomologists, we work a fair amount with pesticides, insecticides. Part of what we do may be doing some third-party testing for companies, so we'll make sure that their chemical works, is safe, isn't causing phototoxicity, or any of those things before they release it commercially. And then, a lot of what we do is honestly working with growers, helping them understand when to spray, how to get out and possibly scout or understand, if the pest is there in proper populations, that the application of a pesticide is truly necessary and is economically feasible.
Every state in the United States has a state forestry agency, and every state is mandated by some law within their statutes that guides that agency.
A lot of it is educating their counties about the diseases and even kind of how to prune trees and stuff. Conservation use consists of windbreaks, it does include timber, riparian plantings, which are along streams to prevent erosion, wildlife, and Christmas tree growing is included in what we sell. We only sell for conservation use.
In all trees, you have the wood in the inside, the bark on the outside, and between the two is a layer of cells called the cambium. And what the cambium is, it makes new cells. It makes more wood on the inside, it makes more bark on the outside. That's how trees get bigger around. And in all our grafting, what we have to do is get cambium, the only place where you get new cells made, cambium of the signwood piece, or the stick that you've got of your good variety, you got to get that cambium on that right next to cambium on the stock or the root stock. And when that happens, you get these cells actively dividing. That's when they will grow together. Grafting is an ancient process. It started with the ancient Sumerians back in what is now Iraq. The Sumerians, as we all know, familiar with now, a little about the topography of Iraq. The southern part of Iraq, as you go south towards Kuwait, you go into the salt swamps. So you get brackish water and you get high salt levels in the soil. As these people tried to grow grapes, because grapes are very important for making wine, and wine's been around forever too. as they tried to grow grapes farther south, they noticed that their vines would die, although there was one vine that could withstand the salt, but it made really poor fruit. So what they did was take that root, split it in half, and took a piece of wood from a good grapevine, make it like a chisel, and just stuck it in between. Then they took, and you had to get this right, because all grafters know you have to get it perfectly right. You have to mix fresh camel dung with mud and put that around the graft union, and what that does is keep in the humidity. And then after that, they'd wrap it with a string to hold that all on. And the graft would take, and the buds from that little stick on top would sprout, and they'd be the good grapes. So grafting's been around forever. In fact, if you look through the history of nut crops, it's interesting. If you go in the late 1800s, there was the great debate whether to plant orchards of seedling trees or orchards of grafted trees. And eventually the grafted people won out because you get a more uniform product, you get larger, a very predictable product. You know it's going to be a certain size, you know it's going to be a certain quality of nut. So that eventually won out.
Right now we have a lot of different tools for managing plant diseases. I'll kind of list them and then mention some details about them. We've got resistant varieties or genetics. There's cultural practices you can use, as well as disease control chemicals like fungicides and things. So genetics or breeding is really critical, and I think that's a big part of the future of plant pathology and plant disease management, and that's where plant breeders are working with plant pathologists to come up with new varieties of plants that have resistance to diseases. And we have had a lot of successes with that. It's a very important part of a disease management program, is using resistant varieties if they're available and if they fit in with your other production needs.
And that would allow us to naturally resist the infection process, or completely avoid, in many cases, the development of the disease. So that can occur, primarily that occurs through just conventional breeding. So that's just crossing with other wheat varieties, for example, and then picking the ones that, identifying those that naturally resist the disease. So plants are not just these simple targets for disease-causing organisms. They fight back, and many of them have very effective ways at fighting back. Some of it may be through their cell walls. The natural structure of the plant may make it very difficult for many organisms to get inside. Many fungi or bacteria can't penetrate unless the plant has been wounded in some way. Much like a person would get a cut and then could risk infections, sometimes plant pathogens can't get into plants unless there's some kind of wound or a structural breach there as well. There are also very active ways of, much like in a plant, or much like in a human's or animal's immune system, that the plant is actively fighting back as well. They produce chemicals that are trying to shut down the growth of the fungus or a bacteria inside the plant as well.
Then another piece of that would be the cultural practices, and that is really huge. What I mean by cultural practices are adjusting maybe planting time, fertilization, the site that you choose to plant that plant into to begin with, with drainage or soil conditions or such. You need to plant the right plant in the right place to make it successful and reduce disease pressure. Irrigation strategies, starting with good quality seed or good quality transplants. All of those are very important components of disease management.
So we might be able to rotate our crops to try and create some distance or space between where we know the disease has occurred in the past and where the disease is not occurred. By finding those places where the disease hasn't occurred, we can provide that distance that reduces the risk of having a severe problem again.
And then we've got the chemical management, which would be through pesticides like fungicides or bactericides. There's a lot of different products, and which one you use and how you use it, and if you're going to use it at all, depends on the crop and the time and some economics and a whole lot of other things.
We get data from a number of sources. The Kansas Water Office is charged by statute with monitoring drought conditions and then advising the governor and other agencies of when we need to do something. And so we get information from any number of sources you might imagine: precip temperature from National Weather Service, from individual reporters is a key. We make sure we get information on stream flow from the U.S. Geological Survey, on soil moisture from the from NRCS, from it's a USDA agency, as well as any number of local entities. And all that kind of comes together both with us and with the state climatologists, as well as the National Climate and Drought Monitoring Center in Nebraska. And we look at all those different things and try and make a determination of at what point are we moving into drought, and what are the impacts such that we need to be doing something.
We have weather records here at our research center that show that 1 out of every 5 years we have less than 75% of our average precipitation. Those weather records go back to 1868, and so we have a very long history of weather records here that show us that 1 out of every 5 years we do have a drought or experience a drought.
Scientists have a real fun challenge when we're trying to compensate for poor weather because, again, most of the scientific endeavors require field work, and so you're trying to mimic the kind of conditions that the producer will endure. And sometimes the questions that you're trying to answer is, you want to have more control over the weather than we actually have. So, for example, here at the university, we've got what's known as rainout shelters. So if we want to simulate drought and how plants will respond under drought, we've got this little shed that will roll over the plot at the first sign of rain and produce a dry condition. So we'll put up the umbrella and cover the plot until the rain goes away so that we can mimic drought even if we're in a wet pattern. But there's, again, limits to what you could do and how much that will influence the results that you're trying to study.
It's important for us to do research and to try to keep track of weather records and animal production and pasture production. That way we can come up with plans and come up with ways to try to reduce the effects of drought. We know that drought's going to occur, and by using this information we can try to come up with ways to try to reduce their effects or its effects as much as possible.
There's no one thing you can look at and say, are we in drought, are we not in drought? Because it's really looking at the impacts of that long-term lack of precipitation. They have to say that's what really defines what level of drought you're in. And it can be very different from one spot to another. We may have one stream in one part of the state that is still doing fine just because of either storage or the watershed, and right over the hill another stream is really hurting. It may have had very similar conditions. And you don't want to just say, well, has it rained the same amount, because the impact's not the same. And so you got to look at all those different factors and say, when do we really need to take action to really, again, mitigate the effects of drought and help people make it through?
Well, there's a lot of different weather variables that would be important in the agriculture world. And wind speed, humidity, wind direction, all of that stuff is extremely important. Because, for example, if you're a rancher and you've got 80 acres of hay down, wind coming out of the south, at least in the central plains, probably has more humidity with it than a north breeze that maybe is a little bit drier. So if you're waiting for your hay crop to cure and get out there and get it baled, you're probably wanting a little drier air coming in. So humidity is very important. And we also talk about the dew point, something that's referenced in a lot of weather reports. And that's still one of those weather variables that may not be well understood, but the dew point is a very simple concept in meteorology. It's just a simple temperature that's a measure of how much moisture truly is in the atmosphere. The dew point is a temperature that if you cool the air to the dew point, you're going to get dew to form. And most of us know what dew is. But in the springtime, when we see dew points above 55 or 60, as a meteorologist, we think we've got enough moisture, we can turn that into rain. And in the summertime, if your dew points drop below 40, that's very, very dry air. Now in the winter time it changes a little bit because cold air, usually dry, our skin dries out. So dew points in the wintertime may be teens and 20s. And in the wintertime, if you got a 20-degree dew point, you can still get, snow or maybe freezing rain out of that. So the dew point is a very important number, and it's pretty easy to understand. The higher the dew point, the more moisture. The lower the number, the less likely it is that you're going to get moisture because the air is very dry. But we like to think higher than 50, good amounts of moisture present. Lower than 50, it's going to be a little tougher to get moisture. But in the wintertime, if you've got a dew point in the 20s, you're in pretty good shape. So that's a really important number.
That wraps up this episode of Real Ag. Remember, you can see every episode of this series by going to SmokyHillsTV.org. Until next time, I'm Kyle Bauer, and this has been Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible by
Servitech has been helping producers across the Midwest make the planet more productive since 1975. We are proud sponsors of Real Ag, helping tell the story of how your food makes it to your plate.
The Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.